And go. Alright guys, it's Brian at home. I promised that there would be a brief overview of the ketogenic diet to follow from the previous video on the primal and Paleolithic diets. And I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about the ketogenic diet than I did on the primal and paleo diets, because I think the ketogenic diet really needs some explaining. It's not as simple as calling it the Atkins diet. It's not as simple as saying just eat super low carb. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail. And let's get started. So this is the ketogenic diet. And for anybody who wonders why I look at my watch, it's because this is how I time myself to make sure that I'm not going over 15 minutes. I don't want to make super long videos, but I think they're about to get longer. I think I'm about to start pushing 20 minutes. Anyway, so the ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet is basically about maintaining a state of what's called nutritional ketosis, as to differentiate it between starvation ketosis. You can go into starvation or into ketosis when you are starving. But the ketogenic diet has gone kind of by other names, and there are certain diets that have a ketogenic element to them. You may have heard of the Atkins diet by Dr. Robert Atkins. You may have heard of the Bulletproof diet by Dave Asprey. And it's sort of a ketogenic diet. It's not strictly speaking a ketogenic diet. I mean, it's a cyclic ketogenic diet. You cycle yourself in and out of ketosis. And this is more of like a hacker's diet. Bulletproof is less about maintaining a state of nutritional ketosis than it is about trying to hack your sleep so that you only have to sleep 4 hours a night, and trying to hack your brain with nootropics and L-theanine in your coffee and all these other things. You may have heard of the bulletproof coffee, which is the idea that you put grass-fed butter inside Dave Asprey's incredibly expensive magic coffee. Dave Asprey did not invent that. People have been putting fat and heavy cream and butter, yak butter, goat butter, and coconut oil. People have been putting fat inside their tea and coffee for a very long time. He did not invent that. So that's sort of a ketogenic diet, but not really. You may have also heard about the Eating Academy by Dr. Peter Attia, and this is one of my favorite sources for information on nutritional ketosis and the biochemistry involved. In fact, Dr. Peter Attia has a 9-part series called The Straight Dope on Cholesterol that I really think everyone should go check out. It will probably be over your head unless you have some training in biochemistry, but he does a really good job of making the truth about cholesterol accessible to the average reader with a college degree, I would say. And even if you don't have a college degree, not that that's necessarily an indication of intelligence. I don't have a college degree, and I don't think anyone would say that I'm stupid. But I think everyone can pull something away from his 9-part series on cholesterol. So, first of all, we need to talk about ketosis, and the most important thing to talk about when it comes to ketosis is what ketosis is not. Ketosis is not ketoacidosis, right? Diabetic ketoacidosis. That is a true diabetic emergency. And that occurs when your blood sugar gets up to 240 milligrams per deciliter, and when your levels of beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is a ketone body that your body produces when it mobilizes body fat, gets to, when your beta-hydroxybutyrate gets to about 15 to 20 millimolars inside your blood. And this can only occur if you produce no insulin. If you produce even the tiniest amounts of insulin, this will not occur. You cannot get into ketoacidosis if you have a functioning pancreas. And even type 2 diabetics, unless they're very severe type 2 diabetics, have difficulty getting into ketoacidosis. This is usually a type 1 diabetic problem, and even that is manageable with insulin injections. But basically what begins to happen is that in a diabetic that is insulin dependent, what begins to happen when your insulin levels fall and you haven't taken your medicine, you haven't taken your insulin shot, is you have all this glucose inside your blood. But it doesn't matter if there's not enough insulin to pull the glucose out of your blood and put it into your cells, most notably your brain. You need insulin to do that, and if you don't produce insulin, then it doesn't matter how much glucose you have inside your blood. Your body reacts to the low serum insulin levels by triggering the mobilization of stored body fat with lipase. So it's lipolysis. You start to mobilize your own stored body fat. And these triglycerides go to your liver, where they are metabolized through a process called beta oxidation. And as beta oxidation continues, your body begins to throw off ketone bodies, and in particular, a ketone body known as beta hydroxybutyrate. And I've spelled it down here if you can read that. But your body begins to throw off beta hydroxybutyrate, and beta hydroxybutyrate is measured in millimolars inside the blood. And the thing is, you still need insulin in order to shuttle all this around. And if you don't produce insulin because you're a type 1 diabetic that didn't take your insulin today, then what happens is you begin to accumulate all of these ketone bodies inside your blood, and it becomes acidic. The pH balance, or rather imbalance of your blood, tends to become very, very acidic. And this is known as diabetic ketoacidosis. And this is a life-threatening condition, but if you have even the slightest amount of insulin, or you can inject yourself with some, then this will not happen to you. It is literally physiologically impossible to experience diabetic ketoacidosis if you have a functioning pancreas, or if you have even trace amounts of insulin inside your blood. So, and as kind of not really a proof, but as kind of a rationale for this, the average amount of beta hydroxybutyrate in someone who is keto adapted, that is to say in an individual who has been eating a ketogenic diet and is adapted to using their own fat stores and dietary fats as a form of energy, the average keto adapted individual produces about 0.5 to 3.0 millimolars of beta hydroxybutyrate. And it tends to be difficult to get much higher than that. I mean, you can go high. There are people who will fast for an entire week, and their levels of beta hydroxybutyrate will get up into 6, 7 millimolars, but still nowhere near the danger level for diabetic ketoacidosis. So, what is ketosis? How do you get into it? I'm going to spare you guys the science. I'm going to make a video on the science behind ketosis and all the different energy pathways and where long and medium chain triglycerides come in, how they get broken down, the production of adenosine triphosphate. But for now, I'm just going to spare you all that and give you what ketosis is, how we get into it, and sort of the rationale behind why it's not dangerous and is in fact required for human survival. So ketosis basically happens when you consistently eat less than 50 grams of carbs per day. I mean, it's a little bit trickier than that. That's not quite accurate. Some people, like diabetics, would need to eat less than 30 to get into ketosis. Some athletes who are burning a lot of energy, they can eat upwards of 100 carbs and still maintain a state of ketosis. So it's very individualized. Ketosis, the ketogenic diet, is to me a diet that puts the personal back in personal training, because there is not a one-size-fits-all for this. Generally speaking, the lower carb you eat, the more you can be sure that you are trending towards a state of ketosis, but there is a period of adaptation. It's not like you have one day where you eat less than 50 carbs and suddenly you're in ketosis. It takes a couple days to get into ketosis when you're keto adapted. Like if you kick yourself out by having too many carbs, it takes you a few days to get back into it. And if you've never been in ketosis before, and you're used to eating a high-carb diet, there may be a period of 3, 6, 12 weeks where you are adapting to using fatty acids and ketones for fuel instead of glycogen and glucose. So what happens in ketosis is that the body switches from glucose to fat as its primary energy source, and the brain becomes dependent on beta-hydroxybutyrate instead of glucose. And I'm running at about 10 minutes, but I think this is going to be a 20-minute video. And so I want to erase this, and I'm going to explain the rationale. I'd like to prove to you mathematically that ketosis is necessary for survival and is most certainly not dangerous and is required for the human race to survive. So in order to talk about this, we have to talk about the fact that in the human body requires a constant influx of ATP. We require adenosine triphosphate every second of our lives. If we stop producing ATP, we die. And we get adenosine triphosphate by breaking apart the carbon bonds found in food. So carbs, fat, protein, these things are not burned as energy. What is burned as energy is adenosine triphosphate. And these things, these energies are released when the carbon bonds are broken. So it's important to understand that the breaking down of the macronutrients that we eat is what produces the basic currency of energy in our bodies. So we need this, and without it, we will literally die. This is actually how cyanide kills you, by the way. Cyanide disrupts a process called the electron transport chain, and it prevents the bulk of how we produce adenosine triphosphate, and that is why cyanide kills you in seconds. Not minutes, not hours, not days. It's not a slow poison. You die in seconds. And you die because you literally cannot survive for 1 second without producing ATP. So it's critically important that we have energy. Fats, fatty acids, carbohydrates which turn into glucose, proteins which break down into amino acids. Something. We need something in order to not die. Now, it's important to understand that our brain represents only about 2% of our total weight and mass. Very small organ, but it accounts for over 20% of our energy expenditure. So this little wetware, this little fiery ball of possibility in between your head bone, accounts for 20% of the energy that you expend every day in order to not die. So what does this look like mathematically? Well, for an individual eating a 2,500 calorie diet, what it means is that 60% of that is what we use to not die, right? Some of that is going to be to fuel our energy and to walk around and to perform activity. But 60% of that is just going to producing ATP. And so that turns out to be 750? Is it 750? Let me get a calculator. Hold on. Because I don't want to lie to you. So 2,500 times decimal 6 yields 1,500. Wow, I am way off. So 1,500 kilocalories of energy goes just to producing ATP. 20% of that goes just to the brain. And so it turns out to be 300 kilocalories that go just to the brain, okay? So, to the brain alone, right? So that's a fairly sizable chunk. of the energy expenditure. Now, the theory goes that the brain has to get its energy source from glucose. And for this conversation, we're going to assume that that's true. There is some evidence that the brain can use lactic acid and free fatty acids to fuel itself. But we're going to go ahead and say that glucose is it. So, glucose only. Now, what that means, 300 calories in glucose. There is about 4 calories per gram of glucose. So we divide that by 4, and basically what we need is 75 grams of glucose every single day. And I'm already pushing 16 minutes here. So I can't go into a lot of the fancy scientific depth. This probably deserves its own series of videos. But we need 75 grams of glucose per day in order to fuel our brains in order to not die. Well, what happens if we can't, find a Big Mac out in the wild? What happens if we can't get a hold of a bag of chips, or we haven't had our Twinkies, or we can't get a hold of wheat, we can't find an apple? What happens when our ancestors that we evolved from couldn't find glucose? Well, how long can they run without a dietary source of carbohydrates? Do we store glucose anywhere in our body? Turns out we do. We store glucose in the liver and in the muscle. And average male can store about 100. Let me grab my red pen. Average male can store about 100 to 120 grams of glycogen. And I use this word glycogen, it's basically the same thing as glucose. Glycogen is just what happens when glucose is acted upon by an enzyme called glycogen synthase, and it takes glucose, hooks it together like Tinker Toys, and it puts them in the muscle or it puts it in the liver. So glycogen is just the storage form of glucose, and we can store about 100 to 120 grams of glycogen, i.e. glucose, inside our liver, and we can store somewhere on the order of 300 to 350 grams inside of our muscle. But unfortunately, this 300 to 350 grams cannot be used by the rest of the body. The glycogen that is attached to the muscle is usable only by the muscle to which it is attached. This is mostly because muscle lacks a particular enzyme necessary to break it down into pure glucose. Muscle can break glycogen down almost to glucose, which is good enough for its needs, but it's not good enough to get glycogen out of the muscle and into the bloodstream. The liver, on the other hand, can release its stores of glycogen. It can break glycogen all the way back down to individual glucose molecules, and it can release glucose into the bloodstream to fuel other organs, your heart, but namely your brain, this massive thing that requires 20% of our energy. So basically we need 75 grams of glucose per day in order to keep the brain from dying. And the liver can supply 100 to 120 grams. Let's assume that you're a 160-pound male. You probably store somewhere on the order of 100 grams. Well, depending on how your body is set up to use amino acids as a source of sugar, because we can take amino acids and through a process called gluconeogenesis, we can turn amino acids into glucose. It's not like our liver is the only source of glucose that we have. So, but we can't do it a lot, or we start stripping all the muscle out of our body. And this is the wasting away effect that you see in starvation, while their muscles just waste away and they're just skin and bones. The body's cannibalizing the protein to turn into glucose to keep the brain alive. But basically, let's assume that we can get half of that from the liver per day, and the rest comes from amino acids. Well, you're basically not going to make much more than 2 or 3 days before you run out of glycogen from your liver and you die. And I mean, if you cannibalize your muscle tissue, maybe you can live for 3 or 4 more days. You know, a week, you know, you would die very, very quickly. You would basically be, you know, minus 75 grams like per day. You would be dead in about 1 to 3 days, maybe 4. Maybe 4, you know, if we start using muscle mass. Maybe 4 if we use muscle mass, but you would surely die very, very quickly. So these people who fast for 30, 40 days in the desert, they don't die in 1 to 4 days, as you might have noticed. And there must be a way that they do that. And the way that they do that is they tap their body fat. They start mobilizing their stored body fat for energy. And by metabolizing the fatty acids from their body fat in the liver through a process called beta oxidation, they begin to produce ketone bodies. They produce beta hydroxybutyrate. And it is the only other fuel that we know of, besides glucose, that the brain can function on, and function quite well on. And so ketone bodies, ketones save the day. Ketones save the day. Ketones is how you survive if you can't get a hold of a dietary source of glucose and your liver runs out of glycogen. Ketones are how you not die, and this is what ketosis and ketogenic diets are all about. They're about eating in such a way that we trigger the production of ketone bodies, specifically beta hydroxybutyrate, inside of our blood, but without starving ourselves. We keep our carbs really low while giving ourselves all of these cruciferous vegetables and fatty cuts of meat and eggs, bacon, and very healthy sources of saturated fat, things like grass-fed butter and coconut oil, and we drizzle olive oil on everything, and so we get a high-fat diet, and we get a moderate amount of protein, but we keep our carbs so low that we basically get ketones to fuel our brain, most of it, and we use ketones and fatty acids to fuel our activities, and we rely upon glycogen only when we absolutely have to, generally for intense bouts of training and in competitions and such. So this has been really brief. I haven't talked about getting into ketosis because this video has gone on for about 24 some odd minutes. And in the next video that's coming right after this, I'm going to talk about how to get into ketosis. Like what it would look like, what you would have to eat like in order to get into ketosis. So stay tuned for that. But I hope this video shows that ketosis is not dangerous. It is not the same thing as diabetic ketoacidosis. And it is highly, highly necessary for survival. We would not survive without some method by which to produce an energy source that could replace glucose when dietary sources of glucose were not plentiful and in which we ran out of stored forms of glucose. So I hope this video has been informative. It hasn't been too sciencey. Kind of had to talk fast. But a video is on the way for how to get into ketosis. So stay tuned.